Everyone, this is Adicon Podfic, back with another podfic. We are getting into, heavy stuff with these couple of chapters because, it's 600 strike. Yeah. And these last two chapters are the end of the Vengeance Saga. So if that stuff makes you queasy, like if blood and guts or anything, okay, trigger warning, blood. Lots of blood and guts. Yeah, blood and guts. Yeah, because it's described in a lot of detail here instead of just stabbing without really being described. But yeah, it's gonna be just described here. Anyway, this is I'll Be Home with Frayed Feathers by Fiction for Life _NZ. I'll be doing chapter 27, 600 Strike, and chapter 28, What Have We Become, I believe it's called. Anyway, let's get right in. And again, blood and guts and gore. So if you don't like that, I recommend skipping over that part. Just when it starts, because I don't really know when it starts. I kind of forgot. Anyway, let's get right into it. It was cold, bone-chillingly, paralyzingly cold, that grew worse as the trident pushed him down, deeper and deeper until he felt the pressure building between his ears, until his breath bubbled back up to the surface from the weight of the water pressing around him. It was dark, terribly dark. The surface was but a faint glimmer above, flickering with colors that were likely Hermes' doing, trying to save him from Poseidon's long-awaited wrath. He hoped they could figure something out in time. It had been an impulse to shove them out of the way so they wouldn't be hurt, but he had seen no other way out of the oncoming strike. At least if Hermes was still up there, he could maybe do something. At least up there they had a chance to avoid being hurt. He didn't want to die down here, but he didn't know how to get back up. His wings were fanned out around him, the feathers waterlogged and heavy, like extra weight dragging him down further. He couldn't move them against the sea, and his limbs weren't much better. It felt like pushing against a boulder, only able to shift it a small margin before he had to regain his breath, something he didn't have down here. The trident, luckily, had not pierced him anywhere. Instead, he was pinned between the prongs, his cloak snagged and hooked around each one to hold him in place. His right hand twitched, trying to reach the golden rooster pin that held it in place around his shoulders. If he could get it loose, he had a chance of slipping free. "You can relax, my friend. I can tell you're getting nervous." Apologies. He was almost thankful now that they had died in the Cyclops' cave all those years ago. At least his death had been relatively quick. At least he hadn't had to see what he'd become in their absence. At least he didn't have to die as a sacrifice to the gods that had tormented him on his journey home. Maybe they would have been home sooner if he'd been there to save them from the club. Maybe if his best friend had survived, he would have been too focused on making sure they were all right to even consider calling out his name to their foe. Maybe he wouldn't have ended up a monster. Look at all we've lost and all we've learned. Eurylochus. If he'd made different decisions or listened to them more, would they have ended up fighting? If he hadn't been so consumed by his own ego, would he have been able to win them over? Could they have trusted each other to get their fleet home? "I'll stay in your heart." He never properly got to say goodbye to her. Could she have held a bit longer if she'd known he hadn't died? Could her broken heart have repaired itself from knowing he was still alive and still fighting to get home, even against the gods? She was still waiting for him, now for a chance to see him in the underworld when he passed, but he didn't want their reunion to be this soon. The rest of his family was still in Ithaca, hoping he would return. Odysseus. The crew. All of them had trusted him to get them home. He had failed them all. Their last moments had been screams for him to save them, to do something, anything that would allow them to make it through the voyage like they had in the war. If he had been a better captain, would they all still be alive? Waiting. He could hear his heart beat through the pressure, building steadily in his ears, gradually slowing as his struggles grew weaker and weaker. The pin was nearly within reach, the tip of his finger grazing the cold metal edge. He had killed them, all of them, and yet they were still here with him. They weren't screaming anymore. They almost sounded sad, like they were trying to comfort him. Their hands were all over him, pressing frozen palms, colder than even the water around him, against his back and wings. Out of his dimming vision, he could see their ghostly forms, smiling at him as they floated over his shoulders. He wanted to tell them he was sorry. He wanted to beg for their forgiveness before he became like them, and he had no air left to speak with. His chest felt ready to explode, and yet his lungs seemed impossibly tight from being starved of air. Any second now he would start to inhale water, his body forcing him to try and take something and that was no longer there. Breathe, darling! Hermes' voice shouted at him in his head. It sounded too clear to be a memory or a trick of his mind. They must have been speaking to him the same way Athena used to. Do something, please! You can't die yet! There has to be some air trapped under your cloak, or... The connection was cut off before the god could go any further. The entire ocean shuddered as something moved above the surface. The sea god must have struck Hermes. As when they came back, the voice was shrill. Ow! 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 Fuck! Darling, I can't stop him. He's too strong. Please, you have to save yourself. The ocean shuddered again, and this time the connection didn't break before Odysseus heard the sickening crunch of a body hitting stone. Hermes was fighting him, but they were losing badly. He strained harder, trying to push his limbs into action. He couldn't let another person be killed because of him. Too many people had been ripped from him because of Poseidon and his monsters. He'd already lost Athena. He would not lose Hermes, too. The hands all over his body were not restraining him in any way, so all he had to focus on was getting his hand around the pin in his cloak. Once that was gone, he would have a chance to kick back to the surface, but his vision was close to blacking out entirely. He had less than a minute before he would be effectively dead. His hand was still brushing the edge of the pin, but he couldn't get a grip around it. Each finger twitched on command, but he couldn't get them to move any further. He was lightheaded and close to inhaling water. It took a lot of his remaining consciousness not to scream as a pale hand closed around his and tugged it away. Just as quickly, another took his place at the pin, their fingers curling around the sides and reaching the mechanism that held the fabric in place. The other ones on his back pressed harder, forcing him to almost sit up underneath the prongs. The ghosts, they weren't holding him down. They were pushing him up, giving him the leverage he would need to free himself from underneath the trident. It was Polites who took hold of the golden rooster pin and ripped it free, letting it sink into the darkness from which he and every other member of the crew had risen from. It was Eurylochus and his mother who pulled away the cloak, freeing him from prongs that had pierced the cloth and held him in place. It was the crew, pushing against one another to lift something that had sunk faster than him despite containing something far lighter. The windbag. They had brought him the windbag. Waiting, Odysseus. Waiting, not for him to die, but for him to survive. They wanted him to survive. With Polites and Eurylochus guiding his near catatonic body, they threaded his fingers beneath the thread holding the bag shut and pulled. It slipped loose, a little line of silver flashing past him in the dark. And then the space around him was flooded with oxygen and howling. His wings flared out instinctively, catching the wind spiraling from the bag and lifting up to the surface. Water streamed past, frothing with bubbles that burst against him as he rose. Everything was moving so rapidly he had to close his eyes, lest he be blinded by the salt. There was an almighty splash as he breached the surface, sucking in breaths like the dying man he was, and carried on with the winds. Up and up and up, until he was acutely aware that there were very little water left around him. He opened his eyes to find it far below. There was rain and winds and dark clouds and air, sweet, heavenly air, but no sea water to hold him down and take his life. He was high above its reach. He was in the sky. The feathered appendages adorning his body were flapping, blown dry by the same winds that had lifted him. It was jerky and slightly erratic, but it was something useful. He wasn't flying. This was far from anything he had seen Hermes do, but his wings were holding him, and he hadn't started plummeting. But he was flailing to stay upright. He had to get control of this quickly, lest he be dropped back into his demise. The raging winds shifted, and without thinking, he moved his wings to catch them, and he went rocketing sideways, somersaulting until the sets on his heels found a rhythm, allowing him to straighten up and simply move with the gale. He was gliding, like a hawk. He could work with this. Both the gods were watching him from below, and it took careful movements to be able to look at them while maintaining motion. He didn't want to risk trying to hover when moving with the winds was keeping him up in the air. He also didn't want to give Poseidon a clear shot, since they'd now ripped their trident out of the seas and were trying to map his flight path so they could strike. Hermes was propped against a little rocky outcropping in the sea, too small to be considered an island, but large enough to not be swallowed by the turning waves. They were bleeding sluggishly from 4 large gashes across their chests, made by Poseidon's claws, which had turned the stone around them into a mix of gold and red. The wings were flared out as they watched him, displaying what could be anything from shock to pride. All except for one. The large right wing on his back was limp against the stone. Broken. Poseidon had broken their wing. "I don't think you get it," he howled to the larger god, his blood alight with fire he hadn't felt since his battles in Troy. "This ends here. I will not die today, not to you or your waves or your monsters. I will get home to my family. I will see my son, and I will see my wife." There was a weight at his hip that hadn't been there before, and he twisted sideways to glimpse the scabbard on a belt that glowed faintly. He nearly entered a spiral trying to pull the weapon free without losing his momentum, but it was worth the risk when he now had some form of protection against a god he had just challenged to a fight. It was the same curved blade that Hermes had used to remove his mangled wings. If it was sharp enough to cut cleanly through muscle and bone, maybe it would be enough to pierce the tough skin of a god. He positioned the blade carefully so that it trailed alongside him as he circled the area. The sea god circled the area, the sea god spinning to keep him in sight. They hadn't made an attempt to bring him down yet. Hermes was still laying on the rock, likely not able to get up in the air again from his injuries, but they were not bowing out of the fight just yet. Odysseus could see the outline of their eyes as they held the staff ready in front of them, channeling their power through it. He couldn't feel it given his weight and the raging storm, but the glow made it fairly obvious as to what they were doing. With his attention still on the winged figure darting through the air currents, Poseidon did not see the water around him frothing in unnatural silver until an army had risen from the depths. Hermes had called them forth to him, 600 men, his crew. "I have lost every comrade," he roared, daring to drop in closer to his enemy. "Every one of my friends died trying to get home, and almost all of them were slaughtered by you. My hands may be stained with their blood, but so are yours. I have paid for my sins. Now it's your turn." The souls of his crew cheered, a raging cry for battle against the one who had killed them. They hefted weapons gifted by Hermes, harpoons, chains, bows, and spears. Odysseus' orders reached their ears even from up in the clouds, guided as he had once been by Athena. Surround him. Old tactics from an old fight, but this time it would end in their favor. Attack from behind. Eurylochus hefted a harpoon and let it fly, securing the golden chain that trailed from the end of it in his grip. The barbed point sank between Poseidon's shoulder blades, prompting a hiss as they tried to reach behind and yank it out, their claws scraping short, and more hands piled onto the chain now that they knew it would not be dug out. "Keep your distance." The trident shot out in an arc, intending to knock Odysseus out of the air. He tilted himself up and threw out his wings, hitting a gale that sent him soaring out of reach. The god's weapon passed over where he had been, but he knew what it meant. All of their attention was back on him. They knew he was ordering the souls. Once he was downed, they could deal with the arrows and spears that were starting to decorate their torso. Stay in his blind spot. He dived into a different air current, closer to being level with the god's head. He didn't want to get any lower than this. There were now 3 harpoons embedded in Poseidon, 2 on his back and 1 below his ribs, the men on the chains pulling them in opposite directions to stop the god from twisting in circles, lest they tear their muscle to shreds in the process. From where he was, they could see him gliding closer. Strike. The blade flashed out, the red tips of his feathers brushing over cold skin before it carved over the Earthshaker's right cheek. It came away with a line of red and gold, and they snarled, "Show him how deadly you are." He pitched himself sideways as he came before their approaching trident, twisting himself between the prongs to re-enter the desired current, lashing out once more at the exposed and hateful face of the god, cleanly slicing off the tip of their long, pointed left ear. They howled. "Exhaust him." With Polites at the front of the line, a chain noose was flung up and over the god's right hand and drawn tight. Those who had died in the Cyclops' cave working to pull it down to the sea's surface, whereupon it was pinned down and struck upon by spears from those waiting directly below. Between the souls hurling sharp points at him from all sides, the captain still darting through the air around their head with a taste for blood, a group holding down one of his hands, the sea god's energy was being drawn out rapidly as they tried to deal with all the separate attacks at once. They were starting to grow desperate in their rage to get rid of them all. Find a breach. Hermes was still slumped against the rock, holding the crew's souls in the living world so that they could fight. Poseidon had seen the messenger god, and they were quickly tiring of this whole fight. Odysseus was trouble enough, but he needed the crew gone. They raised their trident again, this time aiming for their nephew, the wicked prawns ready to impale and put an end to the divinely conjured army. Strike. The blade cleaved over the clenched knuckles, forcing them to drop the trident into the churning depths of the sea. With their other hands still pinned down, all the god could do was tuck it against their chest and bow their chest forward to try and still the blood flow. Push forward. With their opponent weakened, those not already working to drag the god down into the water surged forward, tossing chains to try and get them behind Poseidon's neck. If they could draw his head down, his weakest points would be exposed for them to stab, and that sent fear like a bolt on the god's spine. The Earthshaker jerked his head up, away from the souls with their wickedly sharp spears and harpoons, up where no arrows could reach, eyes open and teeth bared in defiant snarl, directly into Odysseus' path as he dived down, plummeting like a bird of prey under the kill. And strike for the 600 that were lost! The tender flesh around the eye parted along the already bloodied metal. The edge grazed along the organ and partially blurring all vision on that side. Poseidon screamed, and his free hand coming up to cover his damaged eye, his own sharp claws digging grooves along his forehead as he tried to stop the ichor that now oozed from the great line down his face. But the pain was too much for a god that had rarely experienced such things, and they kneeled forward with a high-pitched groan, splashing into the waves that still churned around them, their giant form vanishing like spray tossed about in the rain-filled air. And now, chapter 28. Look what we've become. Odysseus all but crashed into the rocky outcropping where Hermes lay, unable to show himself properly. His hands shot out to brace himself as he hit the ground. The blade he'd carried lost in the bid to stop himself from accidentally caving in his own skull. The jagged edges tore open his palms, slicking the already wet stone with strokes of red as his ruffled wings fanned out around his kneeling form. He'd survived, and he'd flown. Hermes was smiling at him, their staff resting against their hip as they tried to sit up. The souls from the crew had faded away with Poseidon's larger form, their vengeance enacted and their captain safe. The effort of summoning them all and keeping them in the living world had clearly tired the smaller god out more. Ignoring the ache in his own muscles from hitting the ground, he stood up and limped over to them. He didn't resist as they pulled him closer and tucked him under their good wing, hands coated in their own ichor from the still bleeding claw marks. "Don't you ever scare me like that again!" they whispered. "I am so proud of you, so proud of you." He wished he had something more to say than the quiet "thank you," he muttered, but what he didn't have in the words he made up for in action, batting his wings gently against them as he inspected the injury, taking the green cloth that hung across their chest and tying it around their ribs to staunch the blood flow. They hissed as he gingerly lifted their broken wing and folded it manually, tying it in place with the headband they had gifted him. Once they were in Ithaca, it would need to be properly braced. "Ow! I must say, I did not plan on this happening. Ow, ow, ow! It's no fun being grounded." "It's not," he agreed, his own wings still stirring in the winds that continued to blow. Being up in the air, despite all the turmoil and anger, had been exhilarating. He wanted to fly more, now that he knew his wings would hold him. He couldn't imagine how torturous the next few weeks would be for Hermes, who spent most of his time in the air. He helped them to their feet, letting them lean on his shoulder for support. Gods didn't normally get hurt, so pain was not something his great-grandfather handled well. "You idiot!" They both jolted at Poseidon's voice, whipping around a little too quickly since he heard Hermes yelp and felt bile rise in his own throat, to find the other god sprawled out on a rock across from them, one hand still pressed tightly over their bad eye as it oozed gold and red down their face, dripping into the rapidly growing puddle of seawater beneath them. The injuries from the souls of his crew, now just pinpricks across their body, barely visible against the rain and sea spray filling the air. Even now, they were still smiling. "You think you've won? Look around!" They removed the hand from their face to gesture at the raging storm. Odysseus paid it no heed. He already knew what he'd done. All he could focus on was the perfect line that split their otherwise unblemished face. He hoped it would scar. "You sealed your fate. And for what? An empty victory? My storm has been unleashed, and your one way home is now blocked. You'll never get back." "Uncle!" He squeezed the messenger god's shoulder and stepped forward, and they grew quiet in understanding. This was for him to deal with, so he would not interfere. His mind was screaming again, but this time there were no voices he recognized, no crew left for him to feel guilty over. This was the senseless howling of beasts clawing at the edge of his mind, of monsters waiting to be freed from their prison. "You're going to call off that storm," he growled, his voice sounding as though it wasn't completely like his own. Odysseus could not see the way his own eyes glowed like golden and blue embers smoldering in the hearth of divine fire. When Poseidon looked into them, it felt as if they were burning from the inside out. Was this why Hermes was always covered? Was this why Hermes' eyes were always covered? Regardless, the god's grin barely faltered as he advanced. They were afraid, but not enough. Their confidence outweighed their caution. After all, they were a god, and he was just one mortal. "Or what?" they challenged, tapping the side of their head mockingly. "Use your head, little Greek. I'm a god. You can't kill me." His ear wings had drawn forward to shadow his face so that only his eyes still stood out clearly, a focal point for the down sea god. In the dim light of the raging storm, the tip seemed to form a bloodied wreath across his brow, a mimic of those that often adorn the heads of gods. Odysseus tilted his head ever so slightly to the side, as if studying his enemy from a different angle. He bared his teeth, akin to that of a predator giving a warning, and the god swore that for a brief second they had become pointed. He reached for something on the ground between them, giving no reaction as the cold metal burned against his torn hands. Gods didn't handle pain well. Exactly. When small enough for even him to wield, the trident was a beautiful thing, a gleaming silver inlaid with sections of polished black coral and blue gemstones from the depths of the sea. It was heavy, but a manageable weight when he used both hands. He saw the fear in the god's eyes as he raised it, the realization of what they had brought down upon themselves. He resumed his He resumed his approaching, letting the terror wash over and feel him as he stood above them. His mind was consumed once more by the urge to rend, to let his pain out in the only way he now could. He would get home. He wouldn't stop until he did. Wait! Wait! He raised it up and brought it down on their chest. They gasped, claws scrabbling against the sides of the prongs. It hadn't gone in very deep. He wasn't used to wielding such a heavy weapon. He yanked it out, the ends already tinted red and gold, brought it down again. This time it sank deeper, and they wailed, pushing fruitlessly against their own weapon, still too exhausted from the battle to move or defend themselves. How does it feel to be helpless? He pulled the trident out, the monsters in his head howling in delight as the ends of the prongs shredded muscle on their way out. The next strike was accompanied by the cracking of bones. He'd hit their ribs. A few more and he'd be able to get their heart. How does it feel to know pain? They raised one arm up, trying to shield themselves from the next blow. He pierced all the way through their hand and wrist, bringing forth a fresh spray of ichor. Their screams were like music, filling the gap between the storm and them. It only spurred him once more, and he drove the weapon in again, breaking through their rib cage. I watched my friends die in horror. He stabbed their heart, and a mix of red and gold bubbled between their parted jaws, choking on their own blood, just as his crew had beneath the god's waves, crying as they were all slain. He dragged the weapon down on the next thrust, tearing lines along their stomach like gutting a fish, giving him access to all the awful parts inside, parts that he would dig out until all that was left was an empty carcass left to spend their immortal life in agony. I heard their final moments. Their screams had chased him for 10 years, driving him nearly to madness, robbing him of sleep, of his appetite, of his joy, a captain who had failed them, and who had now finally avenged them, calling their captain in vain. Golden red splashed across his wings and torso, a few stray droplets landing on his face. He could see their organs as the points dug in and ripped them apart, fragments of the gods' ribs sinking between their innards, burrowed deeper with every muscle spasm and twitch. Look what you turned me into! Scarred and snarling, with bloodshot eyes and ichor-stained feathers, a god-made monster, bringing their creator to ruin. Look what we've become! Enough! All of the pain that I've been through! Stop! His pride, his friends, his crew, his wings, they were all taken from him and crushed between the hands of gods and monsters who had looked down on him, who despised him for doing what he could to survive, for wanting to get his life back. Haven't I suffered enough? Stop! You didn't stop when I begged you. He aimed for their head, burying 2 prongs in their throat, and the third in the eye he had damaged earlier. More blood bubbled from their mouth, a gargled, choking sound taking the place of their pleas. When he had begged, they hadn't listened. Why should he have to listen to them now that the roles were reversed? You told me to close my heart. The Earthshaker's vocal cords still worked when the trident was removed, but their eye was gone, skewered on the end before being lost somewhere amongst the mist in their chest as he pushed on, pain lancing up his arms from hefting the weapon over and over, the shaft now marked in his own blood, the cold metal searing against the open wounds on his hands. You said the world was dark. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. Everything seemed to be painted in that bright mix of red and gold. It pulled around his feet, the edges of his ankle wings trailing through the colored seawater. The next strike made them convulse, head thrown back and face twisted in agony as they screamed into the heavens. Monster! He was a monster, and that made them one and the same. Look at me, he ordered, twisting the prongs into their throats so that their head was forced up. Without his cloak, his wings were fully on display, the primaries frayed from the salt and the wind. The white underside of his largest set painted in ichor that dripped onto the wet stone beneath his feet. He planted his feet and turned so that they could see his side through the open back of his chiton, at the canvas of overlapping scars that marked a history of self-inflicted mutilation. I made those as I grew up, he shouted. Each one a set of wings I carved off my own body because I was scared of offending you. But you said it yourself. I didn't need my wings for you to get upset. And after everything you've put me through? Everything hurt. His wings, his limbs, his head and his mind. They were all burning. But he wouldn't give up. He had to do this. He had to get rid of the storm. I will never fear you again, he snarled, bringing the trident above their head to split open their skull. I will never stop. I will make you bleed until I have no life left in my body, until I have put you through all the pain I have endured and more. After all, didn't you say that ruthlessness is mercy upon our— All right! Poseidon's voice was hoarse from screaming, but it carried clearly enough that Odysseus knew that this was not just another plea. Their remaining eye was locked onto his, and understanding finally reached. Please. The trident sang as it hit the stone, a metallic chime that echoed across the sea as the storm slowly began to ease. It seemed to chase away the last of the senseless screaming in his head, the monsters in his mind dragged back into the dark pit they had crawled from. He turned away, flicking water and ichor across the mutilated king of the sea. Hermes was pressed against the stones as far from them as he could get. They were shaking, and Odysseus realized what they had just been made to watch. He'd tortured a god. His harsh gaze faltered, and he opened his mouth to reassure them that they were okay, that they were safe. But a light chuckle stopped him, broken by wheezes and coughs as the Earthshaker forced the words out. "After everything you've done, how will you sleep at night?" There was no malice in their tone, but he found he did not care for their change in attitude. Not when his great-grandfather couldn't seem to look away from their uncle's ruined body. He glared at the other god over his shoulder. His ear wings flared out so that they could see his eyes one final time, and when he spoke, his voice was cold, colder than the winds that he had been soaring through, colder than the water he'd been plunged into the depths of, colder than the blood that had stained his hands countless times since he had left his home all those years ago. "Next to my wife." And the god of the sea smiled. It was a small, shaky thing, but it told him everything he needed to know. He would not have to worry about Poseidon ever again. The cycle of bloodshed between them was over. Hermes didn't flinch as he draped one wing around them and guided them away from the bloody side on the rocks. But he felt the shudder that ripped through their body. They snapped back into focus once their feet splashed into the sea foam on the rock's edge, and called together a raft from the remains of the boat they had sailed together in. It was barely big enough for the two of them, with no sails or oars to help them across. They would simply have to wait until the waves pushed them to soar. Hermes had enough energy to create something better, but this would do for now. It would have to, given how close he was to collapsing. Everything had finally caught up to him when he barely held back a sob of pain as the messenger god took hold of his damaged hands and pulled him along. He felt like he was dying again, choking on his own exhaustion and agony, swaying steadily on his feet as Hermes guided him onto the raft and sat him down on the flimsy wooden surface. His mind was full of wool, and his vision was growing blurry. The raft had barely left the rocks before he was slumped forward, caught by his great-grandfather. He passed out before he could hear the panicked yelp. To say Hermes was a mess would be an understatement. It would be more accurate to say he was in shambles. His uncle had broken one of his wings, clawed up his chest, and tried to drown his great-grandson. It was only by some miracle that Odysseus had survived the encounter, and not without Hermes' aid, a joint effort to keep him alive, one that had left them both terribly exhausted and in pain. And then he shuddered, feeling his descendant cling tighter at the movement, their poor hands seeping blood into his ichor-coated clothes. He wasn't sure what that had been exactly, horrifying and frankly traumatizing, but somehow effective. The storm made to stop them had been called off, and his uncle no longer seemed interested in hunting them down. Not that he'd been able to do much for months to come, given the state he'd been left in. The sharp sensation over his ribs was starting to fade into an ache as his body knitted itself back together, the same way Poseidon's eventually would. The wing would take longer, and he mourned the loss of the sky. He would not get to touch until then. Did his great-grandson ever think about how he had been deprived of the sky for nearly his whole life? They hadn't even been able to properly enjoy their first time flying since he was in the middle of fighting for his life. A slightly larger wave pushed against their shoddy vessel, jostling them both and making the winged man in his arms whimper. Hermes was doing his best to keep still, as every little movement seemed to bring them pain. He carefully removed one hand from where it was resting across their back and took hold of one of their wrists, prying their hand free from the knuckle-white grip on his makeshift bandages so that it was palm up for him to inspect. Once he'd had a chance to look at that one, he brought the other up alongside it. First flights tended to end in crashes, but Odysseus's hands had caught the rough surface of the stone as they'd come down, tearing off layers of skin and digging up flesh. Small bits of grit and silver from the trident had burrowed into the open spaces between each wound. He did what he could to draw them out and speed up the healing process with the reserves of power he had left. Wiping away would have become more scarred and permanently damaged hands. It was a slow and painful process, and he felt them stir as the muscles started to reform and the skin grew back. Their eyes fluttered open, a small whine tore from their throats as they tried to pull their hands away from the sting. He shushed them gently, and they quickly gave up trying to escape, resettling against his chest, not quite awake, but not quite asleep either. If only they knew how much trouble they had stirred up amongst the gods. Not just Poseidon, but all of Olympus now knew about Odysseus and his journey to get home. With any luck, something he was going to make sure played in their favor from now on, the interest in Athena's former student would die down once they reached Ithaca, but even then there was a chance a few eyes might persist. It was tempting to just make his great-grandson immortal now to lessen the risks that could come later on down the line. As his kin, they already had a small amount of god blood in them, hence their more youthful appearance. Age affected them slower, but they were far from being unkillable like a god. He held off the idea, though. It was not his choice to make, after all. Calypso had scared Odysseus out of eating anything that Hermes was not able to swear to be normal food. They would not handle such a sudden and drastic change if they had no say in it. Even if Hermes would give the same thing to the rest of his family once the problems at the palace had also been dealt with. Still, if immortality would help keep him and his family safe, Hermes hoped they would at least consider it. He canted his good wing over their back, tucking them closer to his chest as they drifted steadily closer to the island. At least after that, they would sleep through the final leg of the ride home, instead of growing anxious as they had last time, a small chance to recover. Odysseus burrowed his head into the crook of his neck, seeking the warmth that had been ripped from him when the other god had arrived, and Hermes felt foolish for having been even slightly afraid. This wasn't some unfamiliar monster that had collapsed into his arms. This was his great-grandson, exhausted, terrified, and very broken from the hardships they had faced. Even with the drops of divine blood coursing through their veins, they were still very much just a man, one who needed rest and wanted to feel safe again, and Hermes would do his best to give them that. So he ran one hand through their hair while the other helped settle them more comfortably against his body, humming a tune he had made so long ago that he couldn't remember what it was called or what words he had sung with it, but knowing it would bring comfort all the same. The last riches of fear that clung to his great-grandson's sleeping form faded away with the gentle actions, and they slipped fully into Hypnosis' domain. By the time Odysseus woke up, bruises all over their back from their first flight would be dark, and the few remaining scratches on their hands scabbed. The ichor coating their wings would dry and be an absolute pain for the god to clean, having possibly even stained for the once pristine white feathers on the undersides. The mind would be fuzzy from the stress of learning to fly and the rage they'd held in the fight against Poseidon, and it would be at least a few more hours to coax their fragile soul completely back into place from where it had nearly been pulled from. But for now, Odysseus, father of Telemachus, husband of Penelope, and great-grandson of Hermes, slept, held safe in the arms of his kin. And that was chapters 27 and 28 of I'll Be Home with Frayed Feathers. We now have, 8 I'm pretty sure 8 chapters left. 8 chapters left. Yeah. So I hope you all enjoyed. Like I said, blood and gore, especially if you try to imagine it, because, it didn't describe it in as much detail as I thought it would, as I remember it doing, but also, just trying to imagine, a bunch of blood and gore ripped out of a alive human an alive human body. I find it cool in a morbid kind of way, just getting to imagine those kinds of injuries. I don't know, it's weird. I like seeing how injuries affect the human body. It's just, I find it cool. I also have a morbid sense of curiosity about deadly diseases that we can't do shit about. So, that just might be my morbid curiosity. Yeah. Anyway, I hope you all have a good night or day wherever you are. And I will see you in the next one for the second chapter of The Coral Palace. Bye!